On tonight's Double Jeopardy question, what cost $6,500, was made mostly of plastic, and had a picture of a fruit on it? The Apple Power Macintosh 8100 110 megahertz computer. That's right, folks. Original price $6,500. Had this computer sitting at work for about a year now. Someone came in and said, "Here, take this." I said, "Okay." Well, it's not something that I wanted to throw away, and I'm glad I didn't. This is a very unique computer in a lot of ways. Here's some of the specs on it. This is an Apple Power Macintosh model 8100 with 110 megahertz clock speed. This computer was introduced in November 3rd of 1994. It saw a very short production window. It only was produced until August of 1995. The 8100 had been released in early 1994. However, this particular model is the highest end and last version that was produced. It is the 110 megahertz version. It is not the AV version. However, this is a very interesting computer in a lot of ways. It is mostly made of plastic, the only thing metal being the outer case, the power supply, the hard drive, and the CD-ROM and floppy drives. On the back side of the computer we see the Apple logo here, as well as the FCC ID and the model number, and assembled in USA. 1994, copyright 1994 right here. We have an external SCSI port, network port, which I'm going to have to find a dongle for, HDI 45 port, video port, printer port, external modem port, keyboard and mouse port, speaker and microphone, and then we have our DB15 port. This particular computer was manufactured in May 15th, 1995 at 2:42 a.m. It's funny, they've even got the time there for that. Interesting, if you look inside of the power supply in this thing, you notice that it has copper heat sinks for the voltage regulators on here. I'm going to remove the outer case from the rest of the computer. The outer case is held on by these 4 screws, which I have already taken out of the system because I've already looked inside of this. Pop this off, and there we go. We have our internal speaker right here, which is enclosed in a nice box to give it a nice, probably more bassy sound. We have our power supply cable right here, which looks like an ATX cable. I'm curious to know if this is wired up like an ATX, but we basically just jump ring from the power supply over to the motherboard here. I can unplug it from either side of this. And then we got our Apple CD-ROM, which was manufactured in April 1995, which means this drive was made 1 month before the computer was assembled. I have no idea why there's tape right here. As dried out as this tape is, it's probably original from the factory, or pretty close to being that age anyway. Then we got a closer look at the floppy drive. We have a SCSI 2GB drive right here, and our ejectable floppy disk. As you can see, there are no 5¼ inch expansion bays in this computer. The case is entirely made of ABS plastic. As you can see right here, the ABS logo. It is, I guess, Apple's attempt at a cheap case design, even though this thing costs $6,500. It does appear to be mostly toolless, although I haven't completely disassembled this computer yet. And we're going to do that in this video. We've got a latch right here that would slide the hard drive out, assuming the latch would actually lift. Excuse me, CD-ROM, why did I say hard drive? There's also one for the floppy. as well as the hard drive. And this is the original Apple drive. Looks like this has its original hard drive in it. Looks to be a Seagate, which was also manufactured in 1994. Our SCSI cable here, SCSI terminator, and this CD-ROM. And this CD-ROM is also SCSI. We have our connector here for our light, audio cable to the CD-ROM. Another cable here. This connector is going to the speaker itself. Very dusty speaker, although I have to say, given the age of this computer, it's not really all that dusty inside. I mean, it's definitely got dust in it, that's for sure, but I've seen newer computers that are far worse than this. We got our power supply here. UK Limited, made in Thailand. So it's a UK company, had it manufactured in Thailand for Apple. I believe this is year 95, week 17. I'm not entirely certain about that, but I'm pretty sure this is also the original power supply to this computer. We also have a 2 megabyte VRAM card, which also has the optional 2 megabytes of additional memory already installed on this card. This card is installed into the 601 PDS slot, which PDS stands for Processor Direct Slot. In some ways very similar to an AGP slot, in the sense that you could only have one card in the slot and it had direct communication to the processor. The 3 ports underneath were something that I had to look up because I didn't know what the heck those were for. That's actually what Apple refers to as a new bus connector. Apple used that same slot connector for older PDS interface cards. And so I was a little bit confused because I thought that that's what these slots were, was PDS slots. New bus slots are essentially equivalent to, say, a PCI slot or a VESA local bus slot, although it wasn't VESA, it was technically a local bus slot, but it performed the same thing. This is what's interesting about this time period. A lot of manufacturers back in the 90s, early 90s, were trying to find ways of getting around bus limitations, and so they were all coming up with their own proprietary stuff. And there's where our SCSI interface goes into the motherboard. You can see there, Apple, copyright 1994, Apple Computer Incorporated, Power Macintosh 8100, and there is the part number right there. Over to the left we have a crystal audio chip. Blah. I'm going to start disassembling this computer. It should be a lot of fun because I've never disassembled one of these particular Macs before, so we'll see how easy or hard this is going to be. I was quite surprised for a computer of this era to have so many surface mount capacitors and resistors on this thing. I mean, look at those. It's incredible. Particular card, when I looked at this computer before bringing it home, was actually dislodged from its slot. There is nothing that actually holds this card to the back of the computer except for the flimsy ABS clips. I kind of wonder, seeing that, how many of these machines Apple had problems with in shipment because this card would pop out when the computer would get jarred around and stuff like that, because I mean, there's really there's nothing that holds that card in there, and I can't imagine that being a very good design. It does have support on this side for the card to slide into, but yeah, it's quite disappointing to see something like that from a machine that cost $6,500. This was also a time when Apple was not doing very good financially. This was right before, a couple years before, they called in their old buddy, Steve Jobs, to rescue them from their financial crisis. And I don't think Steve Jobs would have approved of this kind of construction if he was still at Apple. Now let's take a closer look at this card real quick. Essentially, this is nothing more than a RAM DAC with some memory on it. Here's our 2 megabytes right here of what looks like 80 nanosecond memory. And when we have 4 72-pin memory sockets right here that are holding 512K each for an additional 2 meg of memory. So this video board has 4 megabytes of video memory on it. Quite a big card for 4 megabytes of memory. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn our attention to the logic board again. Let's go ahead and remove the power supply. Okay, so let's see if we can get this motherboard out of here. So, excuse me, logic board. I'm not exactly sure what that does. Maybe it's a reset button or a power button. Maybe that's what that is. Huh, okay. Well, as long as it's not holding up my motherboard here from coming out, does my theory hold any weight here? Although it sure looks like that should work. I've got to be missing something here. Molex de Mexico. Right there on that pull tab. Molex de Mexico. Wow. Okay. And hey, even back then Apple was using Foxconn. Look at that. Alright, that looks like a second SCSI port. Okay. It feels looser. That's not held on by anything back there, so what is holding me up here? I'm sure there's someone yelling through the computer, "It's this, it's this, it's that." I can't hear you. You might have to scream louder. And yes, folks, I was, at least for a time, Apple certified. Of course, that was during the G5 era. And I wasn't too impressed with Apple's build quality then either. I can imagine a lot of people not being too impressed with this, you know. $6,500 for a big chunk of plastic, I don't know. Okay, Apple, you're supposed to make stuff easy to work on, which has never been a real common thing for you. And I realize that. I may end up having to try to find an old manual of some sort here, because I just don't see why this is not coming out. Now that's what's holding it up. See, once again, I'm relying on my YouTube community to tell me when I make a mistake. I didn't take that screw out. I know. This won't be uploaded for a few days anyway, so I guess you're off the hook this time. I decided, you know, I think it's time that I flip the coin, flip the other side of the coin. Some people would call it going to the light side of the force. Yeah, there you got another latch here. Okay, there we go. And our logic board is free, for the most part. Yeah. And there we go. So there's a few interesting things that I see. Excuse me. I'm too focused on myself here, folks. I'm like, ooh, what is that? Okay, so we've got a cache module here. We also have a ROM sim. Apple, copyright 1984 to 1994. That looks like the ROM chip right here. I'm sure there's some Apple people just yelling at me right now. That's okay, because I am a PC guy. But this particular computer fascinates me because of the type of hardware that's on here. ROM sim, that must be memory for the ROM. And the ROM must load itself into that memory or something. And then, I'll be very curious to know what that AMD chip is for. It looks to me like that's a SCSI, that's a controller for the SCSI. I'm not entirely certain about that. This might as well be something brand new to me, folks. But it's interesting to see an AMD processor of some sort on an Apple computer back then, which means that they had some relationship with AMD even back then. That catches my interest here is the processor. Other than the fact that it's kind of dirty, it has what I believe to be a Peltier device. in between the processor and the heatsink. It's definitely not a cooling fan. Now, you might say, well, what the heck is a Peltier device? I've never heard of such a thing. And in fact, that is exactly what that is. And that's what's getting power right here. Now, what a Peltier device is, and I had one several years ago. Yeah, people used to use those things for overclocking. Basically what it did was one side of the Peltier device would get cold, freezing cold, the other side would get extremely hot. And if you could cool the hot side down really well, then you could get your processors to a freezing point or even sometimes below, depending on how good your cooler was. And I wish that I still had the Peltier device that I used to have, because I would love to try it with modern heat sinks. But as it is, I don't, because it fried a long time ago. So I am curious, 3 of 95, model ST3356. I'm going to have to look that up and see, because I'd be curious to know if I could actually buy one of those. So it's interesting to see this, because when Apple came out with this particular model, they started out at 80 megahertz and then went to 100 and then to 110. Seeing a Peltier device, and I'd be curious to know if the 80 and the 100 has this or not, makes me think that they were overclocking this chip to get all that they could out of it, and they had to use a Peltier device and a heatsink, such as this, which doesn't look like much of a heatsink, but it probably was. Well, you know, considering what was on 486s, you know, something like this was typical on a 486 processor, very close to this. That's definitely more heatsink there. Not by much, but I'd be curious to know if that's what Apple was doing, was actually overclocking the PowerPC chip to get that extra 10 megahertz or whatever out of it. So taking a close look at the memory here, this is VisionTech memory also, which is on the memory riser card, as I would like to call it for the video. This has 60 nanosecond memory on it. Now, what's curious about that, and this doesn't mean this is completely right, but if you look at the spec sheet for this computer, it says supports 880 nanoseconds 72 pin SIMs, minimum RAM speed 80 nanoseconds. So I'm curious about this. Can it support 8 60 nanosecond sticks, or do you have to have 8 80 nanosecond sticks? I'm sure this battery has long since given up its juice. However, it's not leaking, and there's no evidence that it ever was leaking, so that's a good sign. Overall, this looks like this is, I would hope this is going to work. I don't know. Given the fact that Apple used to build extremely better hardware back in the 90s than they have in the last 10 years or so, makes me think, gives me at least a little bit of hope that this computer will fire up. To get our power plug undone here. This is obviously something Apple didn't think about when they designed this. How typical. Boy, that baby's in there. Let me tell you what. I guess it's glued on with age. There we go. Okay. Let's try this again. Yeah, the way this thing's laid out, it should just slide out with a cable attached too. There's a part of me that kind of doesn't want to, you know, disassemble this computer, but I'm fascinated to see what's in this thing. And plus, it needs a good cleaning. So might as well kill two birds with one stone, or 3 if you factor in recording a video for YouTube. Yeah, there we go. And here's the beast we just pulled out. Warranty void if seal is broken. I do not think that we have to worry about that right now. Firmware copyright 1994. Designed and manufactured to Apple specifications. Made in Singapore. It is a 2000 megabyte or 2 gigabyte SCSI hard drive. I don't feel like taking it out of the tray, but it's actually a really light drive. I'm kind of surprised. It feels like a single platter drive, frankly. Made in Mexico. So far, I've not seen one thing that was made in America in this computer. How about the CD-ROM? Was the CD-ROM made in America? Made in Japan? Well, that's probably better. I don't see any pop capacitors yet. I'm going to go ahead and give this thing a thorough cleaning. So in cleaning this motherboard, my curiosity of course got the better of me, and I decided to remove the heatsink Peltier assembly. And there is our IBM PowerPC 601 processor. Now you might be thinking, my God, that is a terrible thermal compound job. And I would agree with you. However, it is interesting to note that after 18 years, this thermal compound is still liquid. So here is the Peltier device, and I want to give you guys a closer look at this if you've never seen something like this. You have this foam around here, and this is supposed to try to insulate the cold or reduce condensation that would build up around the processor and then of course run down and short it out. Now, upon closer inspection, you might think, oh, that's a thermal sensor. No, it's not. And the reason I know it's a Peltier device is because if you peel this foam back, you can see exactly how this device conducts heat. And they put a copper shim right here to conduct heat better. And then it is, I don't know if it's glued or if it's thermal compound or what, but it's adhered to the cold side of that Peltier, and the hot side would go up and conduct into the heat sink, which would then be cooled by the power supply. So it's interesting that they did that. Here's a close-up of what the inside of a Peltier device looks like. With its thermal paste removed, you can get a good clear picture of that IBM PowerPC 601. I realize that Apple went to IBM for their components, primarily the processors obviously, but it's interesting because, you know, when Steve Jobs first started Apple, he was like, we're going to crush IBM and Big Blue and, you know, Big Brother and all that stuff, and yet here they are using IBM's processors. Although, in all honesty, Steve Jobs wasn't at Apple during this time, but still, seems like the spirit to fight IBM would have still been living on at Apple. I don't know. Go ahead and put some modern thermal compound on there with my Roswell thermal instant conductivity compound. And I'm going to do a better job than the poor Apple person did when they were putting this on. That is not the first time I've seen a big gloppy mess of thermal compound put onto a processor. So we have the old girl cleaned and buttoned up. This particular model supports dual monitor. So let's go ahead and fire up this old bad boy and see what we get. Let you hear that startup sound. Not particularly loud. Colors are a little different because they're different monitors. And I believe that even at this point I have no mouse. I wonder if my connector came unplugged. Let me just see real quick here. Yeah, that's what happened. My cable came unplugged. So even at this stage, I have both monitors working here. Right out of the box, nothing set. They just work. As you can see, it takes the old girl a little time to boot up, but okay. So I've already put Warcraft on it, as you can see. I need something to use this computer for, so I thought, why not dig out my old version of Warcraft? Okay, so I was playing with this earlier, and it's interesting that this works exactly like the Windows XP dual monitor support does, and I'll explain that here in a second. I gotta find my mouse pad here. Get out my trusty Montgomery Ward's pad. Okay, here we go. Now we're working. Now we're cooking with gas. Okay, so this works quite well. Nothing set, nothing special. I can drag this icon over to this one, and just like magic, it's there. Same thing, I got this map app here. I moved it over here. I can just drag it back over here if I want to. Bingo bango. We're all good to go. Same thing with this. There's not a whole lot on this computer. Some of these programs don't work, although I think Netscape does. Nope, that doesn't. AOL does. Apple CD Player, that's not there either. I think this individual deleted a lot of stuff. So I loaded up the system with all the RAM I could find to put in it. And right now it's saying total memory is 90 meg. Let's go over here to memory. That's what I'm looking for. It says available built-in memory is 88 meg, available on disk 53. This drive is partitioned to 3 partitions. There's a system partition right here, which I have opening up over here. And then I have a workstation partition, which I put my Warcraft on. And there's also an archive partition on here. And I don't know if these are completely default from Apple, the way this partitions were set up. But the archive is taking up 1 gig of hard drive roughly. 916 meg. I know the workstation is taking up quite a bit too. So the system's only got about 200 meg for it. So that's why it's telling me there's only 53 meg available, because it's pretty much taken up here. But slowly draws that screen when I move it around. So let me show you the display here. Okay, so here we go. This is monitor number 1, monitor number 2. So just like with Windows XP, you hit identify and it shows you which one's number 1 and which one's number 2. So it's showing the second monitor, which is this one, to have a higher color than the first monitor. That's interesting. You can change your gamma here. I like to leave it on max standard. So you can take this just like you do with Windows XP. You can take this and reorient your desktops however you want to. Changes take effect when monitor is closed, so let's go ahead and change that. So now I go down and there's that monitor, like that. which I don't like that. So I'm going to go back into here, go to monitors, and I'm going to orient that back. Now let's, oops, I want to go this way. And now we're back to the way I like it. Okay, so here's the, I'm going to put the microphone closer to the computer here. So this is a droplet. Indigo. Quack. Sheep. That doesn't make any noise. Oh, it's trying to load it. Can't seem to find that file. So sue me. Wild Eep. I kind of like that. That's funny. Okay, so let's go play a little Warcraft here. Say these look good to me.